Imagine wrestling for control of a machine that was designed to be smarter than you, only to realize its brain is now the very thing trying to end your life. On the 27th of November 2008, three seasoned pilots sitting in the cockpit of an Airbus A320 found themselves in exactly that nightmare. They were cruising over the Mediterranean, preparing for a routine maneuver, when their aircraft suddenly decided to rebel. The sophisticated fly-by-wire system, built to be an invisible safety net, transformed into a digital straitjacket. It began fighting their inputs, pointing the nose at the sky and then the sea, robbing them of control second by terrifying second. How did a state-of-the-art airliner, with triple redundant computers, end up trying to kill its own crew? And more critically, could the men inside save themselves before the aircraft finished what it had started? This is the final flight of XL Airways Germany Flight 888T. To understand the madness that unfolded in the cockpit, you have to understand the nature of the flight itself. This wasn't a typical journey packed with holidaymakers. Flight 888T was a ghost flight, officially termed an acceptance flight. The aircraft, a leased Airbus A320, was being handed back from the German charter airline XL to its original owner, Air New Zealand. Before the keys could be handed over, Air New Zealand needed absolute proof that their plane, after years of service, was mechanically perfect. The preparation on the ground was meticulous. For 3 weeks, a team of 3 Air New Zealand engineers had crawled through the fuselage, inspected the engines, and scrutinized every system. The plane had even been stripped of its old XL livery and resprayed in the fresh colors of its original owner, looking pristine and brand new. On board for this final exam were the 3 engineers who had done the work, a safety observer from the New Zealand Aviation Authority, and a third pilot from Air New Zealand, Captain Brian Harrell. His job was to supervise the tests, making sure the German crew checked every box on a long list of flight maneuvers. It was a necessary formality before the plane could be flown to its home base. In the cockpit seats were 2 highly experienced German pilots. At the controls was 51-year-old Captain Norbert Kappeler, a man with over 12,000 flight hours and the seniority of a chief pilot and instructor. Beside him was 58-year-old First Officer Theodor Ketzer, equally seasoned with nearly 12,000 hours of flying under his belt. For these men, this wasn't a stressful passenger run. It was a rare opportunity. They had permission to push the aircraft to its limits, to test its protections in ways that standard flight manuals strictly forbade. It was supposed to be a fun day at the office. After a 2-hour delay on the tarmac at Perpignan-Rivesaltes Airport in the south of France, the crew finally pushed back. At 3:44 p.m., they thundered down runway 33 and lifted off into a gray, overcast sky. Their plan was to head out over the Bay of Biscay, a large marine area, to run through their tests in a clear box of sky, away from other traffic. They had a 2.5-hour window to get it all done. But almost immediately, their timeline began to crumble. Air traffic control had dealt with another XL test flight earlier that day, a flight that had been disruptive, requiring constant special handling. The controller on duty was not in the mood for a repeat performance. When Captain Kappeler requested a simple 360-degree turn to calibrate instruments, the request was flatly denied. The controller informed the crew that no maneuvers would be permitted within the general air traffic flow. They were to stick to their filed flight plan, a rigid line in the sky that offered no room for their intended tests. This was a major problem. The crew now had to improvise. They had a plane full of experts, a list of mandatory checks, and a controller who had effectively grounded their test plan. Captain Kappeler made a quick decision. There was no point flying all the way to the Bay of Biscay if they couldn't do the work there. He told the controller they would head back to Perpignan in about 20 minutes. In the meantime, they would do what tests they could on the fly, and they decided to postpone the most critical checks, specifically the low-speed handling and stall protection tests, until the very end, during the return approach to the airport. Complacency is a slow and silent killer in aviation. So began a rushed, improvised exam. For the next 30 minutes, the crew checked off a series of systems tests. They verified the transponders, checked fuel distribution, and tested the autopilot. Then came the more exciting part, evaluating the Airbus's legendary fly-by-wire protections. In normal law, the computers act as a guardian angel, preventing pilots from exceeding the plane's structural or aerodynamic limits. Captain Kappeler banked the aircraft steeply, far beyond what is normal, and let go of the stick. The computers held the angle perfectly. He pushed the nose over into a high-speed dive to trigger the overspeed warning. The plane performed flawlessly. It was reassuring. The technology was in charge, and it was infallible. But to fully certify the plane, they needed to see how it behaved without the guardian angel, in what's called alternate law. This mode strips away the protections, making the plane feel more like a conventional aircraft, vulnerable to stalls. The supervising pilot, Captain Horrell, instructed the German crew to switch off 2 of the flight control computers, momentarily putting the plane into alternate law. They checked the basic handling, pitch, roll, yaw, and found it normal. Satisfied, they reactivated the computers and the plane returned to its protected state. The final and most critical test remained, verifying the low-speed protections, specifically the alpha floor function. This is the computer's last-ditch effort. If the pilot pulls the nose up too high and the plane risks stalling, alpha floor automatically slams the throttles to full power, regardless of where the pilot has placed them. It's a feature designed to make the plane unstallable. To perform this test, they needed to slow the plane down with the landing gear down and the flaps fully extended. They had to fly so slowly that the plane entered the alpha protection band. It was a safe test, as long as it was done high enough. The rules for this specific flight and common sense dictated that any stall approach maneuvers must be completed above 14,000 feet. But as they descended back towards Perpignan, the crew found themselves in a bind. They were low, they were rushed, and they were running out of time. At 5,000 feet, still descending through the clouds, Captain Kepler voiced the idea that would seal their fate. He suggested they do the low-speed test now, below the cloud layer. It would be convenient. They were already configured for landing. Why not just get it done? The supervising pilot, Captain Horrell, who had earlier stressed the 14,000-foot rule, voiced no objection. The first officer was on board. The controller, unaware of their intentions, cleared them down to 2,000 feet. At 4:43 p.m., level at 2,000 feet above the Mediterranean, with the landing gear down and the flaps set to full, Captain Kepler pulled the throttles to idle. They began to slow. As the airspeed bled off, the plane's nose had to pitch higher and higher to maintain altitude. To help it do this, the aircraft's automatic trim system tilted the massive horizontal stabilizer on the tail. Over 30 seconds, the stabilizer moved from a neutral position all the way to its full nose-up stop, 11.2 degrees. It was now locked in a position that was fighting to push the nose up, held there by the plane's hydraulics. As the speed dropped below VLS, the lowest selectable speed, the captain began to feel the plane getting mushy. He pulled back on the side stick, demanding even more nose-up attitude. They were now flying at just 99 knots, barely above a stall. They waited for the magic of alpha floor to kick in. They waited for the computers to save them. It never happened. Instead, the plane's stall warning blared to life, a sound that should be impossible in normal law. Confused, Captain Kepler immediately slammed the throttles forward, but it was too late. The plane had already recognized a catastrophic data mismatch. Faced with conflicting information, the flight control computers did the only thing they could. They gave up. The plane defaulted directly from normal law down to direct law, the most basic mode. In this mode, the auto trim and all protections are gone. The pilot's side stick now directly controlled the surfaces, but the massive stabilizer, the one that controlled the pitch, was still stuck at its full nose-up position. The plane pitched up violently, reaching 50 degrees nose up. The engines, spooling up from the captain's throttle slam, only amplified this effect, pushing the nose even higher. The aircraft rocketed upward, bleeding off what little airspeed it had left. At the apex, nearly 4,000 feet, it stopped. It hung in the air for a sickening moment, completely stalled. Then, gravity took over. The A320 fell out of the sky, its nose dropping, its wings rocking. The captain pushed his stick full forward, desperately trying to lower the nose. It was useless. The elevators, the small flaps he was controlling, were simply not powerful enough to overcome the massive stabilizer locked against him. The plane began to spin as it fell. The Mediterranean Sea filled the windscreen, growing larger by the second. In the final moments, the captain pulled back on the stick again, finally generating enough airflow to fly. But there was no sky left. At 4:46 p.m., Flight 888T slammed into the water at high speed, just 7 kilometers from the shore. All 7 people on board were killed instantly. The crash sent shockwaves through the aviation world. Pilots were trained to believe the Airbus protections were absolute. How could a plane designed to be unstallable stall? The investigation revealed a terrifying hidden flaw. It traced back to 3 small, fin-like sensors on the outside of the fuselage, the angle of attack probes. These vanes measure the angle of the wind hitting the wing, telling the computers if a stall is imminent. The investigation found that 2 of the 3 sensors had become jammed. They were frozen in place, reporting a low, cruise-level angle of attack, even as the plane pitched up to a stall. What caused them to seize? The answer lay in a seemingly minor procedural breach weeks earlier. During the repainting process, when the aircraft was being cleaned, the ground crew had taken a shortcut. Instead of using approved methods, they had power washed the plane with a high-pressure fire hose. They had failed to cover the delicate AOA sensors. The force of the water forced its way past the seals and deep into the mechanisms. For weeks, the water sat inside. Then, at high altitude on the day of the flight, the temperature plunged. The water froze, locking the vanes in place. The 2 faulty sensors now agreed with each other, sending false but consistent data. The Airbus computers, designed to vote on the information, trusted the 2 frozen sensors over the single working one. So, when the pilots slowed the plane, the computers had no idea the wing was approaching a critical angle. The unstallable protections never activated because the computers didn't know they were needed. They only realized something was wrong when the physical stall occurred, triggering the warning horn, at which point they panicked and dumped the pilots into direct law, leaving them with an impossible control scenario. The crash of Flight 888T wasn't just pilot error. It was a chain reaction of seemingly small, rational decisions. A rushed crew, a restrictive controller, a ground crew taking a shortcut. These individual links forged a chain that pulled a perfectly good airplane out of the sky. In the aftermath, regulators mandated stricter control of non-revenue test flights and enforced rigorous protective covers for sensors during maintenance. Pilot training was updated to emphasize the manual override of the stabilizer trim when protections are lost. The lessons were hard-won, paid for with 7 lives. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want to help us continue exploring the fine line between human error and technological failure, please hit that like button for wins of thought. And let us know in the comments, do you trust a computer to save you, or do you want the pilot to have the final say?